This is Chapter 1, Introduction to Sociology. So what is sociology? Obviously, that's a good place to start in this class. So sociology is the study of groups and group interactions, of societies and social interactions. So sociologists look at things from all levels, including the macro level, which is when we look at large-scale issues and trends among and between large groups and societies. But sociologists also look at things from the micro level, which is studying small groups and even individual interactions. So we're going to have examples of both kinds of research as we move through the class. Both perspectives are important, and which you decide to use as a sociologist is really motivated by what is your research question, right? What are you trying to study in the social world? And guided by that question, that's going to lead you to either a macro or micro approach. We'll talk more about that later. So culture refers to a group's shared practices, values, and beliefs. So culture includes a group's way of life, from the normal or routine everyday interactions that we experience. Now, one of the most important concepts you can learn in this class, that hopefully if you take away anything from this class, it's this. It's the sociological imagination. Think of it as a lens through which to view society, right? So the sociological imagination is a viewpoint, a way to look at the world. It's basically when you connect the macro and the micro. Or to put it another way, when you look at the entire picture and not just a small part of it. So one example could be job loss or unemployment. If we look narrowly at the individual or at that micro level, we miss the larger picture. So in 2008, when the economy crashed, millions of people were affected, with some people losing hours at their jobs, some people faced pay cuts or furloughs, and many others were laid off. So even during a normal economy, millions of people lose their jobs. So this shows how job loss is not just the result of individual actions. Sometimes there's a larger macro level issue that's causing these changes, such as, the global financial crisis, which, trust me, we're going to talk about later. Another example could be homelessness. So in America, we believe so strongly in individualism, this affects how we can then see the world around us. Now, to be clear, we do have agency, meaning we all make choices in our lives, but those choices are constrained by the social reality of the time we live in, and really just kind of like what choices do we even have to choose from. So when we talk about homelessness, we tend to blame individuals for being in that situation. We'll say, well, what do they do to make themselves homeless? And often we ignore the larger structural reasons or factors that lead to some people being more likely to be homeless than others. So going back to that 2008 example again, many people became homeless when the financial crisis happened. It wasn't because they decided I just don't want to go to work anymore, right? I don't feel like I think I'm going to live on the streets, right? They were laid off, since also over half the country has less than $500 in savings for emergencies, and many, many more live paycheck to paycheck. When the job left, so did their money for rent. So if we look at this issue with the sociological imagination, it helps us see both the micro of a person's experience alongside the macro of the structural forces or the historical factors or these things outside of their control that may be happening from the social institutions in society. So all sociologists are interested in people's experiences and how those experiences are shaped by social institutions, with social groups and with larger social institutions like the economy and education, which we'll talk about in this class. So some sociologists study social facts, which are laws, morals, values, even customs like religious beliefs or rituals or fashions, and other cultural rules that govern social life. So again, in this chapter, we're just going to kind of scratch the surface, but a lot of these things we're going to have a full chapter on just to kind of drill into to get you a little bit more in depth. Okay, so looking briefly at the history of sociology. Since as long as there's been people and communities, people within those communities have been studying people and their relationships to their societies. But the history of sociology basically starts after the Enlightenment in the 1700s, which paved the way for more rigorous science, which led to the creation of sociology, right? So before we even thought, if our early scientific notions were, the devil's in you or something like that, we weren't kind of using a more scientific approach. Once you get past that Enlightenment period, you have thinkers like Comte, and who came up with this, concept of positivism. So he stated that sociology needed to be treated like any other scientific discipline. So he laid the groundwork for the discipline, though he called it social physics, which to me sounds like way cooler. Maybe we should have stuck with social physics instead of sociology. But basically, he was a French scientist, and he developed a theory of progress of human thinking from its earliest theological and metaphysical stages towards a positive or scientific stage. So again, positivism, right? Now, he was integral to developing positivism as an approach. And again, positivism just means that people can scientifically approach topics in the social world alongside the physical world, like the hard sciences do. Right? So if we can use science to understand, how physics works, then we can understand social physics. Again, still think social physics would have been way cooler than sociology. Just to be like, yeah, I have a degree in social physics. Anyway, Harriet Martineau is another great thinker, very important to the development of sociology as a discipline. So Martineau was a social activist who traveled to the US and wrote about social changes that were pretty radical for that time period, right? She's one of those parts of our sociological history that shows that sociologists, we like to kind of see ourselves as ruiners. We're those people that spoil stuff for other people because they don't want to see the reality in front of them. So, becoming a sociologist, you become one of a long line of people that call people out on stuff. Anyway, so speaking of which, Martineau is first known because she translated Comte's work into English, which made his ideas accessible to England and the Americas and really spread sociology as a discipline. But on her own, she became a journalist and a political economist, and again, in a time period where women had very little rights and opportunities. And she proclaimed a lot of views that were radical for her time because she was using that sociological imagination. For example, she supported labor unions, she supported the abolition of slavery and women's suffrage. She very famously came to the US and called us out and said, hey, how do you purport to say that you believe in freedom and equality and liberty, yet you put people in chains, yet women have no rights to their bodies or to the vote? And because of that, people were like, cheered her in the streets and were like, you're great. No, I'm just kidding. People hated that and they were like, get out of the country. So sometimes when you speak truth to power, power does not like that, right? That's kind of the whole point. So, she's one of those integral people within sociological history that really show, stick to your guns and call out the BS. Speaking of calling out BS, you have Karl Marx. So Marx was a German philosopher and political activist who contributed significantly to sociology's conflict theory. And we're going to be talking about conflict theory throughout the class. There are these main paradigms of sociological thought, which we'll get into in a minute. And one of the three main ones, and I should just preface, there's more than three, but for an intro class, all you really need to know is the three main ones. One of which is conflict theory. It's very important to how we understand the world, especially through the lens of looking at capitalist societies. So Marx is one of those dudes, you might have heard about him because of like political people fighting back and forth over it, or you hear like someone's a Marxist, right? Scary. But really, when you break down who Marx was, what he said, it's a valuable contribution to political and social thought. And, it's only controversial if you're afraid of people knowing things. So anyway, Marx theorized that capitalism created social inequality. So that's why people aren't super stoked about this guy. So now, I gotta give you a little bit of backstory. This dude was, again, a historian, a political activist, a philosopher. He was a guy who got kicked out of a lot of countries for kind of the same thing Harriet Martineau did, right? Calling folks out. So basically, you have to understand the time period in which he's developing these thoughts. So he saw the advent of capitalism through the Industrial Revolution time period and the ways in which the kind of factory labor jobs were so exploitive. People were dying, children were working in these factories, being maimed, all sorts of stuff, and being paid so, such little compensation for their work. And so looking at it through that context, you can better understand the world he was looking at, the kind of incredible rapid development that happened right at the Industrial Revolution. He, kind of predicted some of the things that then came to pass. So anyway, he basically, again, he said capitalism creates social inequality between the bourgeoisie, who are the people who own the means of production, meaning the people that have money or factories or natural resources or land, and the proletariat, or the workers. So again, if you've heard someone say, oh, that person's so bougie, yeah, they're getting that from bourgeoisie, from Marx. But anyway, so Marx predicted that inequality leads to social class conflict. And sociologists have found that Marx's theories continue to provide powerful tools for understanding social phenomena. His ideas that conflict between social groups is central to the working of society and serves as the engine of social change is one of the most vital perspectives in sociology today. So Marx noted that a small percentage of the population owned the means of production, and thus were able to exploit the masses and thereby ensure greater gains for themselves. So this is the basic tenet of capitalism today. Many modern sociologists use Marx's theories to evaluate contemporary workplaces. I mean, Marx be rolling over in his grave about, Bezos and some of these other billionaires that, have the most concentration of wealth that we've ever seen in the history of time. I mean, it's fascinating time to be analyzing these things from a sociological approach. So we're going to get way more into Marx later, and you'll know much more about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. I'll give you some history there and all sorts of other stuff, but this chapter is more about just kind of setting the groundwork. Okay, so Herbert Spencer, this guy, this poor guy. People have really misinterpreted what he said, but still, he's kind of a jerk. So Herbert Spencer was famous for applying evolutionary theory to social environments, and he came up with the term social Darwinism because he believed that societies evolve through time by adapting to their changing environments. So it's important to understand the actual evolutionary theory before you then apply it to social world. Basically, if the evolutionary theory is saying that, survival of the fittest, what makes someone fittest? It's really interesting. Oftentimes people misinterpret this to mean strength or power. But if you think of it that way, what happened to the dinosaurs? Right? They were the biggest, the most powerful creatures, right? But they weren't the fittest, meaning they weren't the most adaptable, the ones that could adapt and change to their environments as their environments changed. And that's part of why they died out, right? So that's kind of more of what they mean by survival of the fittest, is who's the most adaptable, who can change as our environments change, right? And so he was influential in spreading sociology in Britain and America, but he was also a racist POS, so that's a whole nother thing. Okay. I mean, we're talking about a bunch of old dead white people, so there's some of that sprinkled in. George Simmel. This was a German sociologist who was influential in the discipline in its early years, and really he was important to inspiring other critical theories and theorists that came later, like making them think of stuff and inspiring them so that they kind of became some of the big thinkers in sociology. So he's an important stepping stone there. Durkheim, we're going to talk all sorts about Durkheim in this class and apply him a little bit. So Durkheim studied social factors that bond and hold people together. He wanted to demonstrate that you could study anything as a societal issue. And so he picked something really personal and something that seems like really individual and looked at it from a societal, perspective, and that was suicide. So he studied the relationship between social isolation and suicide at the macro level. So first off, it's really interesting backstory on that. Durkheim did this kind of, deductive approach situation where he took the theories at the time that were actually pretty racist, sexist, etc., that said, who would commit suicide had to do with who had less social power, the most marginalized people, right? So basically, at the time period, they thought women were just kind of insane, so that women would commit suicide more than men because they're just less mentally stable. Of course, this is the time period of like the yellow wallpaper where they would just like lock a woman in a room and be like, you're not allowed to read because it'll hurt you. So anyway, obviously, our ideas about women during that time period were wow. But anyway, he broke through some of those assumptions. There was assumptions that like religious minorities would be more likely to commit suicide, all sorts of just dumb things that people thought, and they were considered knowledge at the time. And this is why we have to be really careful about the knowledge in our time period and make sure we're not just reifying stereotypes, that we do have empirical data, something that can actually show us a relationship and not just say, well, because we know it is, right? Because people know things that are stereotypes. They know things that aren't true every day, right? So as sociologists, we break through that crap. So Durkheim, again, he studied all those things. He said, hey, I'm going to take these 3 hypotheses that are out there in the world and test them and see whether they're relevant or not. And they weren't, right? None of the data supported those assumptions that people had. So instead, he did an inductive approach. He took the research the other direction and said, let me just compile all the data about suicides and see what patterns emerge. And what he found out was that there were certain relationships, which was pretty interesting, meaning if a person had, was married and had kids, they were less likely to commit suicide. There were certain times a year people were more likely to commit suicide. All sorts of these patterns he found. And he developed a new theory based on what he found. And basically said that if people don't have a strong connection to society, then they're more likely to commit suicide. So meaning all of us go through really bad things in our lives. That's a part of life, unfortunately. And for most of us, if we're lucky to have someone there that cares about us, that supports us, then we can have, someone to lean on through those time periods and get through them. But for people who have no attachments to the community, to other resources, to family, to friends, to anything like that, they're more likely to commit suicide. So again, he took something he demonstrated using scientific empirical methods to study social realities. So basically completing what Comte had anticipated about half a century earlier. Also, he looked at the division of labor in society and expressed his belief that social bonds are present in all types of societies, but different types of societies created different kinds of bonds. We'll talk about that a little bit more in chapter 3, but just because learning is repetition, I'll give you a little snippet of it here. So he suggested that mechanical solidarity was experienced by people in agrarian societies. What bound them together was the basis of shared tradition and beliefs, meaning everyone's life was pretty similar, so that's what kept them in solidarity, in mechanical solidarity. On the other hand, he came up with, trying to understand industrial societies where factory work was increasingly specialized or where people had very, very different jobs. And he calls this organic solidarity, meaning people's bonds with each other are based on the tasks they perform and this interdependence, meaning we're bound to each other. We need each other, right? And that, affects the qualities of the bonds. So meaning that they're different. Instead of us all being the same, we need people to be different. Like I need someone to be a veterinarian and a doctor and a mechanic and whatever, so I don't have to be all of those things, right? So Durkheim believed that even the most individualistic of actions has social explanations. So he set out to establish a scientific methodology for these actions. So he chose for his research, like I talked about, not just suicide, he also looked at religious affiliations and religion as an institution, and really tried to show that even the most individual things could be studied sociologically. Pretty interesting guy. So we're going to definitely talk more about Durkheim throughout, because he applies to a lot of the chapters we're going to go through. So anywho, you'll hear him again. Okay, George Herbert Mead studied the connection between thought and action, or between the individual and society. So this dude's what we call a symbolic interactionist. And we'll get through that later, right? I was saying how Karl Marx is a conflict theorist. Symbolic interaction is another main theoretical paradigm that we'll talk about too throughout the class. So if you're like, what the hell are you talking about? No worries, you'll get it at some point. So Mead suggested that social processes give meanings to objects in our society. So people interact, and the meanings come from the interactions. So for example, let's get real philosophical here. A chair isn't inherently important as an object for sitting. So as many of us know, if, let's say you got to reach something up high, you're going to stand on the chair becomes a step stool, right? Or let's say you want to block an entrance, you throw a chair there. right? Or you could just pick up a chair and throw it at somebody, then it becomes a weapon. So, but because we interact on a daily basis with others who use chairs most commonly for sitting, we come to accept that this is the meaning of the object. So it's a trivial example, but the idea can be applied to lots of objects in our society. For example, things like flags or religious icons have meanings that have been shaped by social interactions. So again, means that symbolic interactionist. We'll talk more about that. So he came up also with the terms significant others and generalized others, which we'll go over more when we talk about theories of child development, which were pretty interesting. Also, for some reason, the chapter does not mention Erving Goffman. But he was a symbolic interactionist as well that was important to the discipline, and we will definitely talk about his concept of dramaturgy later on, which says that life is like a play. And, when we talk about the chapter on social interaction, we'll get into that, dude. Okay, so Max Weber, like Marx, Weber also studied how society was becoming industrialized. And he was concerned with the process of rationalization, meaning applying economic logic to all of human activity. I think of it as like computerizing logic. So he believed that contemporary life was filled with disenchantment, the resulting, consequence of dehumanizing features of modern society. So much of Weber's work expressed a pessimistic view of social forces, obviously, such as the work ethic that shaped modern life. But like other social theorists of his time, Weber was interested in the shift from a traditional society to a more industrial society. And as we'll talk about later, because they were watching this happen in their lifetime, and it happened so quickly, it was such an impact. It's kind of like the way in which, if you think about the impact of the internet, or the impact of cell phones, or the impact of smartphones, or, social media, or things like this, like when those things develop so quickly, they have such a strong impact on society in such a short period of time. So Weber proposed that modern industrial societies were characterized by efficient, goal-oriented, rule-governed bureaucracies. And we'll talk all about bureaucracies later. So he believed that individual behavior was increasingly driven by bureaucratic goals, which had become more important motivational factors than tradition, values, or emotion. And so Weber believed this lifestyle left people trapped by their, what we were expected, how we're expected to live, in what he called the iron cage of bureaucratic rules. He's so right. But anyway, and if you've ever been to the DMV and had to stand in line and deal with the stuff, and if they don't have an exact form for you or the right line for you, you know exactly what that iron cage of bureaucratic rules feels like. Okay, last up on this list is, and again, there's a million other thinkers, but this is as many as I'm going to go through today. W.E.B. Du Bois was also essential in developing sociology because he pioneered several sociological methodologies, or the ways we do research, though he was omitted from the history for years because he was African American. So he was also the first black man to earn a doctorate at Harvard in 1895. Some of his classes, because of, laws on segregation, he literally had to sit in the hallway. I mean, Du Bois, man, came up with so many theories we still use today. And like I said, methodologies. So his studies and principles became the foundation for modern sociology. Other than being a sociologist, he was a civil rights activist, and he gave us the term double consciousness, which is the internal conflict that can be experienced by colonized groups in an oppressive society, which we'll talk about later. All right, theory. We're still going with theory, so let's just keep talking about it. Okay, so theoretical perspectives are really important in sociology. It really shows that no matter what topic you're looking at, you can see it from many different perspectives. So theory and hypothesis, right? So theory is a way to explain dimensions of social interaction or social life, and our theory will often develop for us a testable thesis argument that guides our research, or a hypothesis, right? So there's what you think is going to happen, and then you test whether or not that's what happens. Paradigms are philosophical and theoretical frameworks used within a discipline to formulate theories, generalizations, and experiments formed in support of them. So we're going to explore a few major paradigms in this class: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction. But I'm also going to throw feminist theory and some other ones at you because you need them. But those are the three big ones. And even under those umbrellas, there's thousands of different micro theories. And there's also other paradigms than just these three. But these are the three, like, you gotta know to take this class. But anyway, okay, so let's briefly, functionalism. We're gonna keep going over this like week now through a week the end. So you got plenty of time to understand it. Let's just set the groundwork. So functionalism is society is viewed in functionalism as an ordered system of interrelated parts or structures, which are the social institutions that make up our society. And social institutions like family, education, politics, the economy. The way I like to explain it is it's like if each institution in society is a puzzle piece, and all the puzzle pieces have to fit together in order for society to function. And according to functionalists, when one of those pieces changes, all the other ones have to change to adapt. Like, think about that. If you change a puzzle piece, then all the pieces around it would have to change to fit. So each of these different structures, those social institutions, is there to meet the needs of society by performing specific functions for the whole system. So think about that. Education's there for some specific needs, family, politics, the economy, so many other institutions we'll talk about. So the key word there is function. According to this theory, everything in our society has a function. And the main principles of functionalist paradigm is that society is a stable, ordered system of interrelated parts or structures. And again, we'll challenge that stable part later. Two, that each structure has a function that contributes to the continued stability or equilibrium of the whole. So they often study and use the term social institutions, again, which we're going to explore a lot in this class. And remember, social institution is just patterns of beliefs and behaviors that focus on meeting people's social needs. So like government, healthcare, education, all sorts of crap. Okay, conflict theory. This looks at society as a competition for limited resources. So conflict theory sees conflict as the basis of society and social change. So conflict theory proposes that conflict and tension are basic facts of social life, and they suggest that people have disagreements over goals and values and are involved in struggles over both resources and power. So the theory looks at the processes of dominance, competition, upheaval, and social change. And their main emphasis is on materialistic view of society, which looks at, labor practices and economic realities, meaning you have someone like Jeff Bezos who has so much money, like a ridiculous amount of money that we can't even comprehend how much money this guy has. And yet his workers have to pee into bottles because they have such bad labor conditions that they're making him that money, yet they're not sharing in those resources. We'll talk about this more in depth later. And another part of conflict theory is looking at a critical stance towards existing social arrangements, right? Saying, who has power doesn't necessarily mean that those people are better, right? Largely because the people that have power also have more social power to affect the way that we perceive things in society, right? So you think about the way in which people want to be like a Kardashian or live in a mansion or these things because the media promotes the value system of the richest people in society. So we see that as our own value system instead of what, Marx calls it as false consciousness. We'll get to that later. And also, conflict theory is really a dynamic model of historical change. So they really look at how transformation of society is inevitable. It's going to happen. Actually, Marx says that each new kind of phase in society sows the seeds of its own rebellion, right? So we'll talk more about that later and apply that to some specific stuff we're seeing in society today. And then last up, you got symbolic interactionist theory. So this sees interaction and meaning as central to society and assumes meanings are not inherent, but rather created through interactions. So symbolic interactionism is America's unique contribution to sociology and is proved to be the most influential perspective of the 20th century. So for symbolic interactionist, society is produced and reproduced through our interactions with each other by means of language or our interpretations of that language. Symbolic interactionism sees face-to-face interaction as the building block of everything else in society, because it's through interaction that we create a meaningful social reality. So some of the basic tenets of symbolic interactionism as laid out by Bloomer is that we act towards things on the basis of their meanings. So kind of like that chair example, right? A tree can provide a shady place to rest, or it can be an obstacle to building a road or a home. Each of these meanings suggests a different set of actions. And this is true for any physical object, like trees, or just like it is for people, right? Like mothers or police officers, right? Or just like it is for institutions like church or school, or for beliefs like honesty or equality or any social activity. So meanings are not inherent. Rather, they're negotiated through interactions with others. That is, whether the tree is an obstacle or an oasis is not intrinsic to the tree. It's something that people determine and put on that tree. That same tree can mean one thing to one person and something else to another. Also, meanings can change or be modified through interaction. For example, the contractor who sees the tree as an obstacle may be persuaded to spare it by the neighbor. So now the tree is something to build around rather than to bulldoze. So although symbolic interactionism is focused on how both self and society develop through interaction with others, it's useful in explaining and analyzing a wide variety of specific social issues, from inequalities of race, gender, to group dynamics of families or coworkers. Okay, so they're not in here as much, but I'm still going to squeeze a couple more in here, right? They're not part of the three main paradigms, but feminist theory is another one we'll talk about throughout the class. It's kind of, they both of these ones, feminist theory and queer theory, kind of come out of conflict theory and have developed their own approaches. So feminist theory looks at both gender inequalities in society and the way that gender structures the social world, and considers remedies to these inequalities. So there's a link between feminist theory and conflict theory because both deal with stratification and inequality in society, and both seek not only to understand the inequality, but to fix that inequality, to end that inequality. Queer theory proposes that categories of sexual identity are social constructs and that no sexual category is fundamentally either deviant or normal. So queer theory was inspired by gay and lesbian rights movements in the 70s and 80s. And queer theory, itself arose in the late 80s and early 90s. And they proposed that categories of sexuality such as, homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, these are all social constructs. In other words, no sexual category is fundamentally normal. What we consider normal is what we've been socialized to believe is normal, right? Which means that meanings can change as we change our opinions about these things. So anyway, that's a little bit more theory for you. And then I'll sprinkle in a little bit of some other stuff we'll talk about too is postmodernist theory. So postmodernist theory suggests that social reality is diverse, pluralistic, and constantly changing. And postmodernism was a reaction to modernism, right? To understand postmodernism, you have to juxtapose it with modernism, which was the movement against which it was a reaction, right? So modernism is both a historical period and an ideological stance that began with the 18th century Enlightenment, or Age of Reason. And modernist thoughts, they basically thought that scientific knowledge, a linear, time-like view of history, and a belief in the universality of human nature was the way to understand the world. But in postmodernism, there are no absolutes, no claims to truth, reason, right, order, or stability. Everything, therefore, is relative, fragmented, temporary, contingent. Now, why would we talk about this? Well, because, again, postmodernism is important to understanding a lot of these theories in a more modern context. For example, easy example for this one that I think helps set up the context of it is, under modernism, if you looked at an issue like climate change, they would say, science will fix it, right? Science will find a way. But if you looked at it from a more postmodern perspective, you could say, we already could solve it if we wanted to. There's billionaires that have the resources. There's plenty of choices we make in our governmental structures and who's in power that they make to not address climate change. There's also technologies that have existed for 20 plus years that could really deal with the climate crisis and energy, issues and all sorts of stuff. But the power of the fossil fuel industries affects the kind of science and the way that we understand what can be done and what can't. The fact that the oil and gas industry and the coal industries line the pockets of politicians who make the decisions about what we do or don't do as the world burns. right? Again, postmodernism is just an interesting approach that we're going to sprinkle in as well as we go through to better understand the more modern world we're in. Okay, so why take this class? Why study sociology? To understand society, right? We want to understand the social world that we're a part of. Just as anthropologists study other cultures or ancient cultures, we study our own culture, which can be really hard to do since it's everything that seems normal to us. It makes it really hard for people to be critical of their own society, right? If you're an insider, you know the social rules, they just seem normal to you. It's often when we leave those worlds and travel into other social groups that we experience a form of culture shock that makes the invisible become visible to us. So what society, or what society, what sociology teaches people is not to accept easy explanations. It teaches us to organize our thinking so we can ask better questions and find better answers. So a lot of it is critical thinking, which is super needed these days, right? And these times we live in. And when thinking about sociology in the workplace, it's one of those majors that people always say, yeah, but how do you use that? Like, what are you going to do with it? It's kind of ironic. I ended up teaching because people would always be like, what are you going to teach? You're going to be a social worker? And I was like, nah to both. But then somehow I ended up teaching and I actually like it, which is weird. But anyway, so honestly though, sociology is super applicable to many career fields. For example, at Cal State Fullerton, where I also teach, there's literally an entire class that just is like, here's what you can do with your major. And it shows how being able to look at the macro and the micro, being able to understand groups of people, being able to organize information, being able to critically think and have these kind of sociological imagination perspective is actually incredibly applicable to many different career fields, right? All right, well, that's it for this one. And I'll catch you in chapter 3.